Hello, and welcome to this book discussion about manifesting justice. Wrongly convicted women reclaim their rights. I am here today with Valena Beety, the author of this book, and I am Carla Laroche, an associate clinical professor at Washington and Lee University School of Law, and an active member of the ABA Criminal Justice Section, where I'm also the co-chair of the Women in Criminal Justice Task Force. I am honored today to be hosting this conversation with Valena. Valena is an innocence litigator and a former federal prosecutor. She has successfully exonerated wrongfully convicted clients, obtained presidential grants of clemency for nonviolent drug offenders, served and elected as an elected board member of the National Innocence Network, and was appointed commissioner on the West Virginia's Governor's Indigent Defense Commission. She is currently a professor of law at Arizona State University, Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and the deputy director of the Academy for Justice, a criminal justice center that centers research with policy reform. Previously, she founded and directed the West Virginia Innocence Project at the West Virginia University College of Law and practiced as a senior staff attorney at the Mississippi Innocence Project, representing clients on death row. She and her wife live in Phoenix, Arizona, and as of the upcoming school year, she will be at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. Welcome, Valena.
Thank you very much, Carla. Lovely to be here.
All right, let's start off with a summary of your book.
Sure. So the story of this book is really about three women who meet in a drug rehab facility in rural Mississippi. And that's Lee, Tammy, and Kim. And two of those women, Lee and Tammy, they fall in love. And they complete the rehab program and they graduate and they've packed their things ready to go. And this third woman, Kim, their friend, said, "Hey, will you take me with you?" Kim was struggling, and she said, "Will you drop me off with my boyfriend, with my family, something?" She really wanted to leave. And so, of course, they said yes. And within 24 hours, Kim had overdosed. So Lee and Tammy call 911. They get her to a local county hospital, and Kim's in a coma. And the county doctor looks at Kim and thinks that perhaps she has been sexually assaulted. So he alerts the police and they bring in, to determine whether she's been sexually assaulted, they bring in a dentist. I kid you not. So they bring in a dentist, Michael West, and he finds bite marks. And he even alleges, without any evidence to support it, that half of Kim's labia has been chewed off, that's also a bite mark. So who could have done this? Who could have bit this woman except for the two lesbians who she had just been with, Lee and Tammy? And that's what started and ultimately led to their wrongful convictions.
Even the summary that you just indicated is a lot, right? And it is all true. And so as people are going through this book, reading this book, and even long after they have finished this book, what is one thing you want readers to remember about the story about this book?
I want folks to know that wrongful convictions are about far more than DNA evidence. Wrongful convictions are about people going to prison, wrongfully convicted because of their identities as well. And I think we have more awareness about this in terms of racial bias and people going to prison solely because of their racial identity. But it's also because of sexual orientation and because of gender. And I wrote this book partially for my students to be able to see that your career trajectory can change and you can learn and grow, but also for lawyers, because the title of the book, Manifesting Justice, is about post-conviction strategies to challenge wrongful convictions. And one of those is a claim of manifest injustice. So part of this book really is for lawyers to be able to learn more tools post-conviction to challenge these convictions.
Throughout the book, you have an expansive view, or what one might think of when they think of innocence, an expansive view of innocence. And you talk about, like, one of the takeaways was an understanding of people who are innocent going to prison, getting convicted, that involve more than DNA. Can you go into a little more detail about what your definition of innocence or claims of innocence is?
Yeah, I think that the innocence movement has really been unfortunately cabined in by this idea that only DNA evidence can prove someone was wrongfully convicted and can reverse a conviction. If you look at the National Registry of Exonerations, for men and women, it's actually a minority of people who have the DNA evidence to reverse their convictions. Instead, we know there are many hallmarks of wrongful convictions, like false confessions or faulty forensic evidence. But also, I, in my book, talk about the importance of recognizing and addressing police misconduct, prosecutor misconduct, and biases based on race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, how those play a role. And we see conviction integrity units across the country in prosecutors' offices that are re-looking at cases and not looking specifically for is there the evidence to show factual innocence, but instead looking at, can we uphold this conviction? Is there so much wrong with this conviction that we can no longer, in good conscience, uphold it as valid? Particularly if we're trying to reinvigorate trust in our criminal legal system, we can no longer uphold these convictions. So my book focuses on, again, litigating that broader set of cases, because if we're just focusing on DNA, that means a lot of people, and particularly a lot of women and queer people, will remain in prison even if they are innocent. So our current standard excludes people who have been convicted where no crime occurred. So the majority of women who have been exonerated were convicted where literally no crime occurred. And Carla, that sounds crazy, but let's just think about an example of fire science, and a space heater starts a fire and someone dies from that fire. But instead, prosecutors bring charges that they believe someone set the fire. Okay, that person who is wrongfully convicted is not going to have any evidence to show another person set the fire. They're not going to have DNA evidence because it was all an accident. It wasn't a crime at all. So those are some of the folks that we miss in our current view of innocence.
And then, so you talked about those who are directly impacted by eliminating definition of innocence. You mentioned your students. Tell us more about how you hope that students who read your book, future lawyers who read your book, will be inspired by it.
Thank you. So my own career trajectory started with me being a rape victim advocate in college in the city of Chicago and responding to hospitals around the city when they had a survivor come to the emergency room. And from that experience, I wanted to go to law school and become a prosecutor. I wanted to prosecute those offenders. We know that sexual violence is often committed by repeat offenders, people who harm more than one person. And I thought by being a prosecutor, I could stop those cycles of violence. And I went to law school and I got my dream job and became a prosecutor and prosecuted domestic violence and sexual violence. And it was only once I had that position that I saw there are a number of problems with trying to address sexual violence and domestic violence through prosecution, and that frequently survivors didn't want anything to do with me. And I saw myself taking more callous tactics, like arresting survivors, detaining survivors so that they would be forced to be at the trial and testify. And so as I got further and further into that work, I became more and more discouraged that prosecutions were actually solving violence. And up to that point, I had been a carceral feminist. I thought that incarceration was the answer. I no longer believe that. I don't. Um, and a friend of mine was working at the Innocence Project of New Orleans, IPNO, great organization. And I would wheel my big briefcase back from court where I was every day. And I would call him and he'd tell me about, um, being out on the road and talking to witnesses and clients and writing these briefs. And he said, there's a spot opening up at the Mississippi Innocence Project, if you'd be interested. And I thought, well, why not interview? Why not? And I went down there and I ended up meeting an exoneree who had recently been released. And he totally changed my life in that meeting. And I moved to Mississippi and started doing innocence work and never looked back. And I share that with my students to really think about how our careers are long. We continue to learn, we continue to grow, and our trajectories, we learn from every job. So, you know, keep in touch with what is meaningful for you, what is meaningful and valuable work for you. Take what you can from every job and experience, but stay true to that, because you can find your way through, and it's okay to change.
Now that's powerful and so true. Um, for those who then are inspired to go into the innocence work, you mentioned this book is also for lawyers. And so tell us more about how lawyers can use this book in their efforts to seek justice.
So this book not only identifies and explains key causes of wrongful convictions, like faulty forensic evidence, so like the bite marks that were used against Lee and Tammy that were bogus bite marks. So it identifies different causes of wrongful convictions, but it also talks about nationally what are these different post-conviction strategies for challenging convictions, not just innocence and trying to get a conviction reversed based on innocence, but instead looking at miscarriages of justice, looking at how courts can use a cumulative error review instead of dismissing every problem as harmless error, looking at it all together to say, again, should we uphold this conviction? And there's states that are leading the way on this. Massachusetts is one of them. And one thing I really learned from writing this book is how many different states have different ways to challenge convictions post-conviction. And I'll just throw out that Texas and California and West Virginia and Wyoming, a number of states also have forensic science habeas writs now, where you can challenge your conviction if there was faulty forensic evidence used against you.
So for the directly impacted, for future law students as well as lawyers, and then for those who are doing the work on the ground. Really powerful in one book. What can be just with an understanding of what the goal of your book is. Let's go deeper into it, into the different themes that manifesting justice has. I will say, and as I will say my bias, which is looking at families and the intersection of families and family law and the criminal legal system. And so that was one of the things that I saw, but I would love to hear the different themes that you purposely included in manifesting justice overall.
One of the main themes was both wrongful convictions of women and queer people, but also the importance of women in challenging wrongful convictions and family members. So Lee and Tammy, I mean, their convictions were reversed because of the tremendous work of their mothers. It was their mothers who filed a FOIA request with the FBI and found the exculpatory evidence, the Brady evidence that was never turned over. It was their mothers that fought for them for years that reversed their convictions. And so I really in the book try to focus on um, how it takes a whole team, family of people to reverse a conviction. If you ever see that photo of just an attorney and a client on the day they walk out of prison, that is missing
Mm.
the majority of the story, that there's so many more people involved. So yeah, I wanted to just provide that broader context as a theme as well.
And what other themes? I know I called out the one I liked, or I noticed more throughout the book, but what other themes do you have in talking about identities and like who it can be harmed versus who is harmed? Tell the reader more about that.
Sure. So it is a long book. And so I encourage folks to, if you want, just pick out different chapters in it. So there's a chapter on how transgender individuals are wrongfully convicted and giving examples of that. There's a chapter specifically on queer people and a history of criminalizing queer people for over a century. So that's another component of this. There's more information on women being wrongfully convicted, particularly of no crime wrongful convictions, which Lee and Tammy are a no crime wrongful conviction. There's a theme of disability as well, that we see people who are identified as having disabilities in this book not listened to, marginalized, pushed aside. And yet we have people with substance use disorder, which is also a disability, demonized and demonized for um, that disability of substance use disorder. So I talk about those components as well, and how our different identities sadly are part of why we can be seen as criminals by prosecutors and the police. And I want to point out that everyone in Lee and Tammy's case, Lee, Tammy, Kim, the prosecutors, the police, the doctors, they were all white. So there wasn't that added racial component, but race compounds these wrongful convictions, compounds the likelihood of being wrongfully arrested, wrongfully charged, wrongfully convicted. So I talk about that a bit too. And we have innocence projects in every single state across the country because these wrongful convictions happen in all of our communities.
Thank you. Right. So this is a personal story for you in the sense of like through your own experience, you learned and really delved deeper into some of the issues that you witnessed and you supported and represented individuals for on behalf of these individuals, and also a story about the larger criminal legal system. But overall, what did you learn by writing this book?
Mm, I learned there are even more people wrongfully convicted as women, as queer people, which was my main focus of this book, than I even knew about. So since then, I've heard from people who have reached out to me, and that it's just an area that's been a blind spot. That hasn't been recognized. And the number of people who are wrongfully convicted, again, specifically where their sexual orientation is used against them. So Carla, if you'll
Yeah.
indulge me for a minute to read a bit of the testimony from trial here. So at the trial, because they did go to trial, the prosecution had this dentist on the stand, right? And this dentist has now become an expert in any number of things. He's the key state witness. And he's also now presented as an expert in sexual orientation as well. So he's asked about whether in a homosexual rape case, which is what they're identifying this as, homosexual rape case, you would expect to find bite marks. It would not be unusual at all to find bite marks on the skin. And Dr. West responds, no, it wouldn't be unusual. And the prosecutor says, it would be almost expected. And he says, almost. And he talks about the bite mark of the labia as sexual orientation combative. So that's the state's evidence. But the really doubly tragic part is that the defense expert witness, the expert witness for the defense, Dr. Galvez, a forensic pathologist, he gets on the stand and he's asked, would you expect to find biting, or would biting be consistent with a lesbian rape type situation in a homosexual rape? And Dr. Galvez says, yes. And homosexual crimes, they are very sadistic. The most violent times I've seen in my experience are homosexual to homosexual. They do what we call overkill. They do tremendous damage, tremendous damage. And I mean, the prosecutor follows up, they're brutal assaults. He says, yes, they're gory. The more repulsive crimes I've ever seen were homosexual to homosexual. And in writing this book, I learned that type of expert testimony has been used against other queer people in trials, which is completely unfounded, completely baseless. And yet that type of testimony itself has been used. So part of my message and takeaway is also to defense attorneys to object, to make the objections, to not allow this evidence in, to stipulate that someone is a lesbian or transgender or gay, so that it's not the prosecutor who is trying to salaciously stoke homophobic bias by bringing that out, right? If it's like, nope, we don't need to talk about this anymore because we've already agreed that the client is LGBTQ, then you don't have as much of this really, again, testimony that's meant to stoke bias.
Great. Thank you for reading what were the actual words of experts, or supposed experts, in Tammy and Lee's trial. Thank you for sharing this information just more broadly. Is there anything else that you want to bring up for future readers to know about you or this book?
Well, this is a research and litigation area for me, and I'm happy to talk with people who are themselves working on cases where their clients are queer or are women. Women are also negatively portrayed as bad moms. They're often wrongfully convicted for roles where they are caretakers, and that they aren't living up to these gender assumptions as caretakers and stereotyped that way. So I'm happy to be a resource for anyone who's out there working on those kinds of cases. And I'm always happy to talk about the book as well.
Thank you. Okay. And so with that, I want to thank Valena again. Please, you see in the background as well, Manifesting Justice. Take it at your, buy it at your local bookstore. Reach out if you are more interested about this issue. And thank you so much, Valena.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And thank you for the work of the criminal justice section of the ABA.